up guys, it is JTX here again, bringing you guys another Bleed Bow League Starter video. Now a lot has happened since the last league and this current league with the changes to the Gladiator Ascendancy, and you guys will be surprised to know that we're actually not going to go Gladiator this time round. And there's a couple of reasons why we're going to go Slayer this time instead of Gladiator. One of the main reasons being with the removal of Challenger charges from Gladiator, there's only really 3 Ascendancy nodes that Gladiator can take. Whilst the new Gladiator nodes are really powerful, the justification of only having a 3 Ascendancy build doesn't really seem worth it compared to what Slayer can offer and what the power you can get back from Gladiator through gear or Forbidden Flame, Forbidden Flesh jewels. I'll quickly talk about the build itself. I have a lot of videos on this channel talking about how Bleed works, previous versions of Bleed, a lot of content for Bleed if you do want to educate yourself about how the build itself works. This is more of an update to the current settlers of Kalguur League and how the build functions now as a Slayer instead of a Gladiator. In the PoB below, I have leveling trees from level 1 all the way up to your end game, and these trees have been tweaked a little to match the new patch. The main difference between Gladiator and Slayer is getting bleed chance early. Gladiator used to have a node that gave 50% chance to bleed. We need to make up for that on the tree. Luckily, they've added a couple of nodes that give additional bleed chance. So we have Wicked Blade up here, and then we have Bloodletting down here. Just grabbing these nodes will give us a good chance to bleed in the early game, and then we cap that off with our final bleed nodes here at Savage Wounds. So we'll get 100% bleed chance on the tree, and then we can supplement that later with vulnerability and other pieces of gear like Haemophillia. The endgame version of the Bleed Bow now has been changing over the last couple leagues, and I think it's settled into the identity of being a endurance charge, frenzy charge, stacking with Ralakesh, and then taking advantage of Alessa's belt to get affliction charges. That seems to be the way to do the build now, by stacking as many frenzies as you can and double dipping with those charges. So the endgame version of the build will have between 8 to 9 endurance charges, frenzy charges, and 8 or 9 affliction charges. These charges can be even pushed even further if you want to get frenzy charge on rings. You want to go really crazy with corruptions, probably get up to 10, 11, 12. But for endgame purposes, 8 or 9 is where we'll put our benchmark for this build. With the changes to endurance charges giving reduced elemental damage taken, it actually makes it ridiculously strong for defense. And also because we're playing a Slayer now, we get access to a lot of the quality of life Ascendancy nodes from Slayer. I'll talk about the Slayer Ascendancy here and why we actually benefit a lot from the actual Slayer Ascendancy. In the acts, you'll start with Brutal Fervor, so you'll have Overleech. Surprisingly, Split Arrow is obviously it's still a hit-based skill, so you will benefit from this while you're leveling. Only later do you really scale the dot portion of it, so your Split Arrow doesn't do as much front-loaded damage, but during the acts it's actually pretty decent for sustaining your life. And this allows us to take Endless Hunger next. This is a really nice quality of life node, especially because we're playing a snipe channel playstyle. It just means you can't be stunned out of the snipe as long as you're leeching a little bit. And it also makes us immune to bleeding, which is always a nice thing. And the increased attack speed while leeching, that's also really good for channeling our snipes. The thing I want to talk about here is the 20% of overkill damage is leeched as life. Surprisingly, bleed explosions, or the pops that you get from killing enemies, they can actually leech life. So this node of overkill damage being leeched as life, that actually applies to the bleed explosions that we create. So we actually get a huge amount of value from just blowing up packs of mobs and all of that damage being leeched to us, and then we get overleech as a Slayer. This is a pretty cool interaction that I didn't realize was in the game, because obviously I haven't played Slayer in a very long time, but here we are. The third Ascendancy we take is Bane of Legends, really good generic more damage, so 10% more damage if you killed recently. Also helps us with not taking physical reflected damage, so makes our maps makes rolling maps a little bit easier for us. And obviously 20% more damage with hits and ailments against unique enemies, so because there's ailments, we also do 20% more damage with bleeds against unique bosses. The final node we take is Masterful Form. So this is where the build kind of comes together in terms of frenzy stacking. Masterful Form just makes your endurance charges equal to your frenzy charges. So you want to stack as many frenzy charges as possible, and then that will give you your endurance charges. This is the one you take in Uber Lab, because at that point, you're going to be trying to acquire more and more gear. One of the major changes that you'll notice with the build is because we're not playing Gladiator anymore, we don't have access to bleed pops from the Ascendancy. How do we make up for that? We have to make do with every other champion in Slayer or any other version of Bleed that wasn't playing Gladiator and use a pair of gloves called Haemophillia. Haemophillia is essentially a tuned down version of the Bleed Ascendancy, where instead of popping for 20%, it explodes for 5% of the enemy's total max HP. So this will let you map pretty efficiently early on as soon as you can acquire them. Generally, they're pretty cheap on the market. Not sure how much they'll be after the video, but generally they're a pretty common pair of gloves that you can pick up day one for maybe 1 chaos, 2 chaos. They pretty much provide you the bleed pops that you're missing from Gladiator itself. And also you can corrupt really cool implicits onto this, like +1 max frenzy or curse enemies with vulnerability on hit. Those might be a little bit more pricey, but just keep that in mind that those are your options before you actually swap into a Forbidden Flame Flesh setup. Your endgame setup would look like this, where you take gratuitous violence on your Forbidden Flame, Forbidden Flesh jewels. The bleed pops are actually pretty insane. They're at 20% now, up from 10% in the previous leagues. That probably might mean these jewels might be a little bit pricey throughout the league. We're not sure how popular this will become. If you can't get access to these Forbidden Flame, Forbidden Flesh jewels, there's a lot of other options. You could take Fortitude from Champion. You could take the other nodes from Gladiator, the ones that help us. So Aggravating Bleeds, or enemies take increased damage for each second they've been near us. The other big change for this league is the removal of Ensnaring Arrow in our setup. So Ensnaring Arrow previously made enemies count as moving, and it was really, really necessary for our damage because it tripled our damage. However, now we have a new mechanic called Aggravated Bleeding. Aggravated Bleeding is essentially the same mechanic, which makes enemies count as if they were moving, or they take extra damage as if they were moving. And there are a few ways of getting this now in the game. The first one is obviously you can play Gladiator and get that Ascendancy node that makes all your attacks aggravated by default. Now you can get it on the tree through a Bleeding Mastery. Attack hits aggravate any bleeding on targets, which is older than 4 seconds. My understanding of how this works is after 4 seconds, the next hit will aggravate the existing bleed on the target. So it pretty much means you're 4 seconds before your triple damage will kick in. This may sound like a long time, but in reality, how our old setup worked is we hit enemies with like a big puncture, and then we'd be waiting for an ensnaring arrow to hit the target as well. So maybe that takes like a second and a half anyway in the first place. And it won't really affect your clearing setup because normally you won't really care about applying ensnaring arrows on targets that you're just blasting. The other way of actually getting aggravating is on your gear. So it's a new Eldritch Implicit on your gloves. There are a pair of boots called the Tempest Rising. These boots make enemies count as moving if they're affected by an elemental ailment. You can do some shenanigans with venal puncture there, but not something that this build would really look at, but just be aware that that is an option as well. You notice that I said that Aggravating Bleed is on gloves, but we're using Haemophillia. So that just means most likely you'll be using the Mastery on the tree until you actually swap to a rare pair of gloves and you get your bleed exposure from your jewels. I'll quickly talk about the tree itself now. The early levels haven't really changed much. The only change is grabbing Wicked Blade up here as one of the new bleed notables to give us more bleeding chance early on in the act. And then our general tree is still relatively similar until we hit our 65 to 86 one. This is when we start going for the frenzy charges on the tree. So one here, Savagery, and one up here with Fervor. This also gives us a nice bit of spell suppress here on Quick Step and on Intuition, which is always nice for the build because we do want to try cap our suppress early on into maps. This is pretty close to what your final tree will look like after you swap to your, Timeless Jewels and your Cluster Jewels. Trying to grab as many Frenzy Charges as possible, and then later on we would anoint Frenetic on our Amulet. And that will give you a baseline of 8 Frenzy Charges with nothing else on your gear. Tattoos are back in the game, so we can get Spell Suppress, Resistance, a bunch of other nice things from the tattoos on the tree. And you can combo that with the Elegant Hubris Keystone, Supreme Ostentation, which requires your gear to have no stats. That's also an option, so you can tattoo your whole tree. That was a tech from Trials of the Ancestors League. The other major change that we have this league is also to a lot of auras that we run. In the past, we'd run War Banner and Flesh and Stone. Both of those auras don't really help us now, so it kind of makes it a little bit easier to determine which auras we want to keep on. So for the act, you'll always want to have Herald of Purity and Pride, and then you'll pick up Determination when you get into maps. Later on, you add in a Malevolence, and those are the main auras that you'll slot into the build to actually give you the majority of your damage/defense. Haste is also an aura option if you can fit it into the build. That depends on how much mana reservation efficiency you can cram in. I believe you can put in a haste as well, depending on if you have an enlightened setup and also other efficiency on your gear. General single target and clearing setups are still the same. You're still going to be using snipe and puncture. and you're still going to be using a Split Arrow for your clearing setup. Puncture and Split Arrow both have their added physical damage removed now, but our actual multiplier of effective added damage has increased. So I think in the end game, you're going to be getting a lot more value on those gems. The other minor changes to note are Snipe has had its mana cost increased by 1. Puncture's mana cost has gone up as well, but that's not something we care about because we're putting it into our Snipe setup. A cool thing about this league is because we have the Kalguur Reflecting Mists coming back, you can put rings and jewelries into those mists, and then they can reflect it, doubling the stats. So potentially you can get up to -6 to channeling or -14 to non-channeling skill costs. So that's going to help a lot with our mana sustain if we are worried about any mana increases in the build. But generally, having a little bit of leech and a bit of mana reduction on the tree is enough for our build to function pretty comfortably throughout the maps. The other major change as well is the change to quality for both weapons and armor. We're more interested in the weapons. Now that quality is a more multiplier, our bows will actually be much stronger from the early game all the way to the end game. Make sure you quality your bows early on, especially with the changes to how whetstones work, that you get a big chunk of quality on lower level items. I think at the top end, you're going to be getting a significant boost in damage just from that quality change alone. And with Recombinators coming back, you can make some very powerful items early on, potentially by combining fractured modifiers together. I'm not sure yet if you'll still be allowed to get double fractured items. Either way, you can still make really powerful physical bows early on. Obviously, a Slayer variant of this build is pretty unique and hasn't had a lot of playtime compared to Gladiator builds. I think it's very viable as a new version of Bleed Bow, considering that you have to change your build with the times to match what's happening in the game itself. The other minor note is that the bleeding suffix for increased chance to bleed and increased bleeding damage on bows has been removed. That's not a huge deal for us because generally that's just a very nice cherry on top mod that we have on bows. Most people don't even have those rolls on the bows. Just something to note if you're looking for that roll, can't roll with bows anymore. With our old Manaforged Frenzy tech with Ensnaring Arrow, we're getting rid of Ensnaring Arrow now, but it no longer helps with making enemies take more damage with bleed. Instead, we're turning Manaforged Frenzy setup into a pure utility setup. So we're running that with Culling Strike and Maim. Both of those are really good nice quality of lives for our build. Maim obviously making enemies taking more physical damage, and Culling Strike pretty much helps us get the last 10% of a boss's HP. So these are now pure utility links for your Frenzy setup. As a quick note, to generate our endurance charges early on, we're going to be running an Enduring Cry with automation support until we get our Rally-Catch boots, grants us permanent uptime on our endurance charges. This will also help early on into maps because you have a nice burst of regen when you pop Enduring Cry, and also it's done automated for you. That's kind of one of the nice changes of getting rid of 2 auras and the Ensnaring Arrow. We free up a lot of gem sockets on the build because that was something that we had trouble with in the past because we had just so many utility and aura gems that we needed to slot in. Also, a quick note, with your Timeless Jewel in the past, you always wanted to go for either increased physical damage or for 50% increased bleeding damage and bleed steel damage faster. Now with the Frenzy and Endurance Charge stacking version of this build, you actually have a lot more options in flexibility. Potentially you can go for nodes like this, which is 10% increased damage per endurance charge. If you can actually get to 9 frenzy charges / endurance charges, this node would actually be better than your 80% generic. Please use the Timeless Jewel search function in Path of Building. It will tell you which jewel works best for your build. This way you won't have to try find the perfect jewel that matches mine or a perfect jewel that gives 80% increased physical damage. It opens up a lot of options for your Timeless Jewels. Normally where in the past, a lot of these jewels got very expensive because there's only 1 or 2 that really fit builds like this. Overall, I think this Slayer version of the build has extremely good potential for carrying on the Bleed Bow legacy. It's a little bit sad that Gladiator no longer seems to be in the contention for Bleed Bow builds. I believe the changes are to benefit more melee-focused bleeds. And I believe in the past, Champion and Slayer were the actual better versions of the Bleed Bow in the first place, which is kind of the sad thing to note. And with the removal of Challenger charges to Gladiator, we're probably going to be sticking to Slayer for the foreseeable future. I think Bleed Bow is still in a fine place, especially with this version of it. Frenzy charge stacking has always been one of the endgame ways to scale it. Just note, if you're playing SSF, until you get Haemophillias, your clear is not going to feel great. This is also true if you can't pick up Haemophillias early on. Remember, your bleed explosions scale with physical damage or with generic increased damage, so you can actually scale up how much those explosions do. Other than that, I hope you guys have enjoyed the updated league starter guide. I think it's going to be an amazing league. I think you guys will have a lot of fun with this build. I'll most likely be streaming the league start at my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/JTX. Hope to see you guys there for the league start. Hope you guys have a great league start, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.